be great. So welcome to Canio's Books Evening, an event with Tom Petriano. We're pleased to see everyone here. We are looking forward to another wonderful presentation by Tom. Tonight, he's going to be talking about Let Us Dream, Pope Francis's reflection on a post-COVID world. That's Pope Francis's latest book, which Marianne is showing in her screen there on the, well, who knows where she is in your matrix, but she's there. So, we asked Tom about talking about Pope Francis's book. And, as we continue to live through the COVID pandemic, we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond to this experience? And, how do we make sense of like the pain that it's brought to our lives? The great pain and suffering of losing someone, and then just the day-to-day pain of having to live without the comfort of being able to be with friends, and hug a person, things of that nature. So in Pope Francis's new book, he shares his reflections on the challenges and the opportunities actually that are presented in a time of duress like our pandemic. Tom's going to talk quite a bit about that. A number of you probably are familiar with Professor Tom, but let me give you a background for those who are not. Tom is a professor and chair of religious studies at St. Joseph's College, where he teaches on both the Patchogue and the Brooklyn campuses. He received his doctorate in theology from Fordham University, and he teaches courses on a wide variety of religious topics, including Islam, Buddhism, and world religions. He's a strong interest in the teachings of Thomas Merton, and he shared with us that his most recent class that he's teaching right now, that he's created, is Religion, Race, and Racism, which sounds fascinating. We'd love to hear more about that. Maybe he'll come back and talk to us about that later. But at this moment, we're here to dive into Let Us Dream, living in a post-COVID world, with words of Pope Francis and Tom to guide us through that. So would you please give a very warm Zoom welcome to Tom Petriano.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces out there in this format that we've been all too accustomed to, I think, over the past year. I want to start by thanking Catherine and Marianne and Canio's for creating this space. They've done a lot of terrific things, especially this past year when it's been difficult for so many of us to get together, to create a space where there could be exchanges like the one we're having tonight and others that have taken place over the past year, exchanges of intellectual and spiritual and cultural ideas. It's a great service to all of us. So I would like to thank them. And thank you, all of you, for taking some time out of your Saturday evening to join me in my enthusiasm for this book that Pope Francis published, I think in December was when it first came out. I would like to use some visuals. I have a PowerPoint and kind of work back and forth with the visuals. So bear with me for a second as I share the screen and begin talking about this particular book and why it has become particularly meaningful and valuable to me. The book came out in December, and it's really a reporting really of a series of interviews that Pope Francis gave to a British journalist named Austin Iverly. And the result of those interviews was this book, Let Us Dream, which, as you can see, has been published in many different languages throughout the world. By my recollection, it's just about a year since we began this strange journey into lockdown. And this iconic image from last Good Friday, I think everybody remembers it, and I think it will be remembered in history, when Good Friday was observed without anyone in St. Peter's Square. And I think it was actually raining that night, and Pope Francis was there by himself. And here we find ourselves a year later in the pandemic, a year that has been characterized by tremendous, as Catherine said, pain and struggle. And the book really is an invitation for us to reflect on the past year what it means for us and what it can mean for the future as well. It's divided into to three sections. Part one is a time to see. In the past year of change and crisis, Pope Francis says, my mind and heart have overflowed with people, people I think of and pray for, and sometimes cry with, people with names and faces, people who died without saying goodbye to those they loved, families in difficulty, even going hungry because there's no work. I think all of us could probably say the same thing, right? Our minds are filled with the thoughts of people who have endured so much during the past year, so much difficulty. And I thought it would be appropriate and very much in the spirit of the book as we begin tonight to pause for a moment of silence, to bring those people to mind and bring them to a moment of prayerful remembrance. This particular scene, everybody remembers from January 5th, the night before the inauguration, when there was a prayer service in front of the Washington Monument. And at that time, the candles represented some 400,000 people of our own country alone who lost their lives to COVID. Now the number is over 500,000. So I would like to just invite us all to a moment of silence and quiet reflection, lifting up those who have lost their lives to this disease, those who live with loss, those who have cared for so many during the past year. And maybe even think of Pope Francis, who right now is probably in one of the most dangerous corners of the world in Iraq, bringing a message of peace. So let us enter into a moment of silence. Okay, well, thank you. May their memory be a blessing for all of us. Pope Francis begins this book with a quote from one of his favorite poets, a German poet named Friedrich Holderlin. And he begins with this sentence that really caught my attention. Where the danger is, also grows the saving power. That becomes the theme, I think, that weaves its way throughout the book. During this time of danger that we have all experienced, there is also the possibility for saving power. He reminds us of that throughout the text. He reminds us that from this crisis, we can come out better or worse. We can slide backward or we can create something new. And I think that's really the challenge, isn't it? Really, what are we going to emerge with? And as more and more we hear talks of returning to normalcy, what does that mean? Do we really want to go back to things the way they were without recognizing the need for some issues that need to be addressed and some things that clearly need to be changed? And so Francis reminds us, I think, of an important caveat as we all look forward with great enthusiasm to doing some of the things we miss doing, hugging loved ones, visiting with friends, social gatherings. We all look forward to that, but in doing so, do we want to also create something new out of what we all have gone through this past year? I'm hoping we'll have some time at the end of my overview of the book and some of the themes of the book and some of the lines that jumped out to me. I'm hoping after we finish that we'll have some time for our own exchange of ideas on how this can happen, how there's the potential to slide backward, or how we can indeed create something new. I love the fact that very early on in the book, Francis offers us these words that I am thinking at this time of the saints who live next door. They are heroes, doctors, volunteers, religious sisters, priests, shop workers, all performing their duty so that society can continue functioning. How many doctors and nurses have died? How many religious sisters have died? All serving. If we become aware of this miracle of the next door saints, if we can follow their tracks, the miracle will end well for the good of all. I'm particularly thankful that he reminds us of these essential workers, the true heroes of the year. Probably all of us know someone who can fit into that category, one of those categories that he identifies, people silently, quietly performing their duties. Dorothy Day, he doesn't mention Dorothy Day in the book, but he was a big fan of Dorothy Day. And Dorothy Day lived through the 1918 pandemic. And she, at that time, was actually working as a nurse. And I think it was Bellevue Hospital. I'm pretty sure it was Bellevue. And in The Long Loneliness, her autobiography, she has a couple of paragraphs in which she offers her reflections on what it was like being a nurse during the pandemic and being at the bedside of so many people who were breathing their last breaths with her. And she used this wonderful phrase that has resonated with me. And I think it's kind of the thing Pope Francis is talking about in this sentence that we have before us. She talks about the sacrament of duty. I just love that phrase. We're accustomed to identifying the seven sacraments, baptism and confirmation and Eucharist, and those seven sacraments we all can name so well. But she uses duty as a sacrament. She identifies duty as a sacrament. And I know a couple of friends who are nurses and who have really struggled through this pandemic, and who I can really testify, as I'm sure all of us do, really, stories of their extraordinary holiness in being at the bedside and comforting those who were not able to be with their loved ones as they breathe their last breaths. Truly, not only the heroes, but as Pope Francis reminds us, the saints who live next door. Francis has a great way of using words and images, many of which he takes from the scriptures. And in his conversations with Austin Iverly, he talks about a Noah moment. He compares what we've been through the past year to the great flood that's talked about in the book of Genesis. And he has this great description of what he calls a Noah moment. He says, but the good news is that an ark awaits us to carry us to a new tomorrow. COVID-19 is our Noah moment, as long as we can find our way to the ark of the ties that unite us, of love and of a common belonging. That's a big theme throughout the book: common belonging, fraternity. You can see in his conversations that are recorded in this book that he was already thinking about his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, all brothers and sisters together, common belonging. And he says that's really essential to us finding our way to a new tomorrow. The Noah story in Genesis is not just about how God offered a path out of destruction, but about all that followed. The regeneration of human society meant a return to respecting limits. This is Pope Francis over and over again, reminding us of what we really need to do: a return to respecting limits, curbing the reckless pursuit of wealth and power, looking out for the poor and those living on the edges. See, this is what I think he means when we don't want to just go back to the way things were, because part of what's happened in the past years because of the way things were. And this is one of several reminders of that he challenges us with throughout the book. The introduction of the Sabbath and the Jubilee, moments of recovery and reparation, forgiving debts and restoring relationships, were key to that regeneration, giving time for the earth to bounce back, for the poor to find fresh hope, for people to find their souls again. That is the grace available to us now, the light in the midst of our tribulation. Let us not throw it away. So we can be on the brink of a Noah moment. I love the section in part one of the book where he talks about COVID moments, right? We've all experienced very directly or indirectly COVID-19, but for Pope Francis, it becomes a metaphor for other moments in our lives, moments that he says that are ripe for change and for conversion. He uses the word stoppage here. Each of us has had our own stoppage, something that kind of crashes us into a wall. Or if we haven't yet, we will someday. Illness, the failure of a marriage or a business, some great disappointment or betrayal. As in the COVID-19 lockdown, those moments generate a tension, a crisis that reveals what's in our hearts. In every personal COVID, so to speak, in every stoppage, what is revealed is what needs to change. Our lack of internal freedom, the idols we have been serving, the ideologies we have tried to live by, the relationships we have neglected. And with these sentences come an invitation to all of us who read the book to think of what other COVID moments have been perhaps in our lives, and how they have been opportunities for change, calls to change. And he gets rather personal in the book in talking about his own COVID moments as a way of encouraging and inviting us to identify our COVID moments. And so he talks about 3 COVID moments that he had in his own life. And he talks with great honesty and openness, I think, about these moments. The first of which, he says, occurred in 1957. And some of us who are familiar with his biography know that at the age of 21, he came very close to death and lost part of one lung. And he writes he says to Austin Iverley, who writes in the book, for months, I did not know whether I would live or die. The serious illness I lived through taught me to depend on the goodness and generosity of others. And in reflecting on that particular first COVID moment in his life, he talks about 3 nurses who cared for him, 2 of whom were sisters, and how their attention to him was so crucial to his finding his way through this moment. And interestingly, he still remembers them. He speaks of them by name. They are the names he gives to the goodness and generosity of others who helped him through this moment. And then he talks about 1986, when he went to Germany. He was working on a dissertation for a doctorate that he never completed. And he says his year in Germany was a COVID of displacement. Isn't that a really interesting term he uses, right? He's not talking about COVID here as an illness. He's talking about it as the experience of studying German while far away from his beloved Argentina, far away from home. It was a time of displacement, a time of loneliness, a time of being a part. It was his kind of lockdown, actually. It was for him, he didn't enjoy studying German and being away from Argentina. In fact, he talks about a soccer game. He's a great soccer fan, still is. And he had no one to share the enthusiasm of his team winning when he was there, no one to share that with. Taken from where you are and sent to where you do not know. And in the process, you learn what really matters in the place you left behind. Perhaps that's a kind of COVID moment some of us may identify with, the COVID of displacement. And certainly in some ways, we've already experienced it this past year in the separations we had to live with from family and friends and loved ones. And then he talks about his experience in Cordoba in Argentina from 1990 to 1992, where he went into almost a kind of exile after a very, very difficult time when he was the superior of the Jesuit community in Argentina. And he had to make some really difficult decisions about some of the Jesuit priests who had become very involved in strong, almost to the point of violent protests against the Argentine government and the atrocities committed by the Argentine government. And he was accused of, by some of his, can you imagine this, right? Can you imagine? He was accused by some of his fellow Jesuit priests of siding too much with the government and being too heavy-handed in his exercise of leadership and curbing their involvement in some of their activities. And this was an extraordinarily difficult period for him. And he says it was a kind of lockdown, self-isolating, as so many of us have done lately. And I love this sentence, right? And it did me good. So I wonder if all of us, and I think, when Catherine and Marianne asked me about the possibility of doing this, and I was very eager to share some thoughts with you about this book, but then we had to decide when would be a good time to do it. And I thought maybe halfway through Lent, as we find ourselves now, would be a good time for us to think about some of the questions he raises here and to look back on the past year. Not only are we halfway through Lent, but we are at just about at the 1 year point in which this whole experience began for us. Can we see anything as we look back that we could identify as something that did us good? That would be a really interesting question to contemplate as we find ourselves sort of halfway through Lent. He says for him, he wrote and he prayed a lot. And what I find absolutely fascinating, and I included it at the bottom of this slide, this is like 2 years that he's in this self-imposed lockdown and sort of reassessing his life. And it was a big turning point for him in his life. He started reading, right? Now, he wasn't even a bishop then, right? He was a Jesuit priest. He had been superior of the Jesuits in Argentina. But for whatever reason, he picks up and starts reading a 37-volume account of the history of the popes by a German scholar, Ludwig Pastor. And and he found it fascinating. I mean, at that point, having any kind of role or leadership any further along in his career in the church was the last thing in his mind. But for whatever reason, he was curious about the lives of the popes. And in some way, God's grace or the Spirit was at work, it seems to me, and I think it seemed to him, preparing him for a future he had no idea would be his, as he learned some of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the history of the papacy. It's funny how God's Spirit works in unknown ways in our lives, preparing us in ways we don't even imagine or suspect for the ongoing call of God's Spirit to us in each of our lives. The big theme in part 1 of this book is what he calls learning to see from the peripheries. And the word periphery is sort of one of the standard words that Pope Francis loves to use. I think from the very beginning of his papacy, as I followed as much as I could some of his writings, his interviews, his sermons, he loves the word periphery or the word marginal or marginalized. The people who are on the peripheries, and because of which they don't gain too much of our attention. We don't, and remember, part one of this book is called A Time to See. And what he is suggesting is during this past year, the challenges for us is to see from the perspective of those most affected. He says, in a sense, the pandemic has exposed the hidden pandemics of our world. In other words, COVID-19 is not the only pandemic that the world is facing. He uses the word pandemic as a metaphor for other tragedies that are experienced by so many of the masses of our world. The pandemic of hunger, of poverty, of violence, of environmental degradation. And if we come out of the pandemic of COVID-19, as it appears we're, perhaps God willing, on the cusp of doing, we are missing a vital message if we lose sight of these other pandemics that are rampant throughout our world. As we see the need around us, this is right, a time to see, he says, God asks us to dare to create something new. We cannot return to the false securities of the political and economic systems we had before the crisis. I think this is a tremendously challenging sentence, right? Because it's precisely the false securities of the political and economic systems we had before the crisis that in so many ways have made the crisis as severe as it has been. We need economies that give to all access to the fruits of creation, to the basic needs of life, to land, lodging, and labor. He mentions these three words throughout the book. Because he's from Argentina, he loves to use the Spanish, and he uses in Spanish. It's three T's: tierra, trabajo, tierra, techo, trabajo, right? Land, lodging, and labor, and that's like a refrain throughout the book. The needs, the basic needs of life. We need a politics that can integrate and dialogue with the poor, the excluded, and the vulnerable, that gives people a say in the decisions that affect their lives. We need to slow down, take stock, and design better ways of living together on this earth. Don't you think it would be pretty easy to make a list? I would love to do this, especially for Marianne and Catherine. I would love to make a list of all the people I would love to send this book to and buy copies. And I think that would be a really interesting list. As I was reading the book, I think of so many leaders. People like you and I are reading this book, and it's great. I just hope that there are people who are at higher levels of power and levers of change that also can heed this message. That takes us to that very quick summary that was of part one, and it takes us now to part two of the book, which he calls, what time is it? A time to choose. Okay. A time of trial is always a time of distinguishing the paths of the good that lead to the future from other paths that lead nowhere or backward. You can see some of his Jesuit background coming out in this statement, the Jesuit ideal of discernment that St. Ignatius teaches us to discern paths to follow, to discern the path of the good, and in choosing the path of the good through discernment, knowing other paths that lead nowhere or lead backward. This, he tells Austin and tells us, is the time to choose. He talks about, in this section, the paradox that the pandemic has exposed. What is the paradox? It's the paradox that while we are more connected, and certainly we have been more connected, become more connected because of the pandemic, it's just what we're doing now on Zoom, and probably all of us have had the experience of Zoom time with families and connecting with others. It's been an opportunity to, for me, and I suspect for all of us, it'd be an interesting thing to talk about, an opportunity to reconnect with others, though not in person. But he says we are also divided. Feverish consumerism breaks the bonds of belonging. It causes us to focus on our self-preservation and make us anxious. Our fears are exacerbated and exploited by a certain kind of populist politics that seeks power over society. It's hard to build a culture of encounter in which we meet as people with a shared dignity within a throwaway culture that regards the well-being of the elderly, the unemployed, the disabled, and the unborn as peripheral to our own well-being. There's that word peripheral again. And another phrase that Francis loves to use, a culture of encounter. Even before the pandemic, this was an expression that he frequently turned to in his writings and his homilies, and more so than ever now in the post-pandemic world. He challenges us to choose to create, to build a culture of encounter, where we encounter others, especially those on the peripheries, with regard for their dignity and their well-being. I love the section he has in his book, in which he calls the leading role of women one of the greatest signs of hope to come out of the pandemic. Great section where he says, women have been the most affected and the most resilient in this crisis. So before he even gets to women who have helped in the crisis, he reminds us that women have been the most affected, but also the most resilient. He reminds us that they are more likely to be on the front line of the pandemic and harder hit economically. And he reminds us, countries with women presidents and prime ministers have on the whole fared better. And we all know that to be true. I think New Zealand is one of the examples that comes up all the time in that regard. And he asked this question. I love this question. Could it be that in this crisis, the perspective women bring is what the world needs at this time to face the coming challenges? And he says, I am thinking especially at this time of women economists. And he mentions in particular one Italian woman economist. Interestingly, Pope Francis has gathered around him a committee of economists who he meets with and consults with regularly. I mean, he's really, really serious about trying to create a more economically viable and equitable world. And among the economists, he's he tells us quite clearly he's thinking of women economists. I love this picture. This is a pre-pandemic picture, but if I had the time, I could have easily chosen a picture from his interactions with um, a Shiite ruler in Iraq just today, which was an extraordinary meeting and an example of Pope Francis's kind of keen awareness of the importance of dialogue and engaging in that himself. And this quote speaks to that. As the public arena has become increasingly dominated by the beleaguered self, anxious, controlling, quick to take offense, self-justifying, our society risks becoming ever more divided and fragmented. And then, with tremendous honesty, he says, the church is not immune to this contagion. So again, he's using the language of the pandemic, the language of COVID, to the language here of contagion, to talk about another kind of contagion. How do we act in contexts of tribal division when our politics, our society, our media seem at times to be one long shouting match in which opponents seek to cancel each other in a game of power? He talks here now about verbal violence that he argues reflects a fragility of selfhood, a loss of roots, in which security is found in discrediting others through narratives that let us feel righteous and give us reason for silencing others. The absence of sincere dialogue in our public culture makes it harder to generate a shared horizon toward which we can all move forward together. When that sincere dialogue takes place, there's a wonderful metaphor again that he uses. He's so great at using metaphors. And he uses the language of the 23rd Psalm, my cup runneth over, that in moments of genuine encounter and dialogue, there can occur a moment of breaking the banks of confined thinking. Breaking the banks of confined thinking. That in genuine dialogue, when it is engaged in sincerely, there can be overflows of love. Overflows of love happen above all at the crossroads of life, at moments of openness, fragility, and humility, when the ocean of his love bursts the dams of our self-sufficiency, and so allows for a new imagination of the possible. Because this can happen, is what he's trying to say, in moments of genuine dialogue. That overflow that can happen in dialogue, okay, can also remind us of an overflow of mercy that we can experience in the aftermath of the past year. Millions have asked themselves where they might find God in this crisis. He suggests his response to that question is, I see an overflow of mercy spilling out in our midst. Hearts have been tested. The crisis has called forth in some a new courage and compassion. Some have been sifted and have responded with a desire to reimagine our world. Others have come to the aid of those in need in concrete ways that can transform our neighbor's suffering. That fills me with hope that we might come out of this crisis better. But we have to see clearly, choose well, and act right. Let's talk about how. Let's allow God's words to Isaiah to speak to us. Come, let us talk this over. Let us dare to dream. He really wants us all to be dreamers as we come through this, not to think of how we can go back, but to look of how we can go forward and create something newer and better. And key in doing that for Pope Francis, in imagining and dreaming a new and better future, are what he calls the antibodies of indifference. He says, they are the antibodies to the virus of indifference. So another kind of virus is indifference. They remind us that our lives are a gift and we grow by giving of ourselves, not preserving ourselves, but losing ourselves in service. So right here, I think in this image, you find what he means by the antibodies to the virus of indifference. This is just that same quote with a different image. The kind of image, the many images we have become familiar with of courage and compassion. Part 3, the final section of this short but powerful collection of interviews, conversations, is a time to act. He says, in times of crisis and tribulation, when we are shaken out of our sclerotic, it's a great word, right? Sclerotic, becoming rigid and unresponsive, losing the ability to adapt. When we are shaken out of our sclerotic habits, the love of God comes out to purify us, to remind us we are a people, one people. This is the consistent theme, right? We are a people. Beyond nationalisms, beyond tribalisms, beyond ethnic separations, we are a people. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but it's not cooperating. Oh, here we go. Yeah, good. Times of tribulation offer the possibility that what oppresses the people, both internally and externally, can be overthrown and a new age of freedom begin. Crisis has shown us that our peoples are not subject to blind forces, but in adversity are capable of acting. Calamities unmask our shared vulnerability and expose those false, superfluous securities around which we had organized our plans, routines, and priorities. Such a powerful sentence, isn't it? This past year for all of us has unmasked, he wants to say, as individuals, and I think as a nation, as a world, our shared vulnerability. And in so doing, exposed the false and superfluous securities around which we had organized our plans, routines, and priorities. Sorry. We must not let the current clarifying moment pass us by. It's a real urgent call, right? He talks about fraternity as the new frontier. And you can see here in these words from his conversation with Austin Iverley, that there is already sort of the seeds germinating for his encyclical on human fraternity that came out a couple months after these interviews. He says, if faced with the challenge, not just of this pandemic, but of all the ills that afflict us at this time, we can act as a single people. Life and society will change for the better. This is not just an idea, but a call to each of us, an invitation to abandon the self-defeating isolation of individualism, to flow out of my own little lagoon into the broad river of a reality and a destiny of which I am part, yet which at the same time lie beyond me. This idea of fraternity as the new frontier is captured very well in the sentence that accompanies this image. That sentence is not exactly from the book, but it's the same idea. You can see these thoughts that he's been living with. There is no time today for indifference. Either we are brothers or sisters, or everything will fall apart. Fraternity is the new frontier for humanity on which we need to build. It is the challenge of our century. And he comes, as the book is drawing to an end, almost full circle, once again talking about the periphery. The health of a society can be judged by its periphery. A periphery that is abandoned, sidelined, despised, and neglected shows an unstable, unhealthy society that cannot long survive without major reforms. From the edges comes the hope of restoring the dignity of people. To embrace the margins is to expand our horizons, for we see more clearly and broadly from the edges of society. God asks us to dare, there's the word dare again, to create something new. We cannot return to the false securities of the political and economic systems we had before the crisis. We need economies that give to all access to the fruits of creation, life, land, lodging, and labor. We need politics that integrate dialogue with the poor, the excluded, and the vulnerable, that gives people a say in the discussion, in the decisions that affect their lives. We need to slow down, take stock, and design better ways of living together on this earth. At the very end of the interviews, he uses another metaphor, the metaphor of a labyrinth. He says the pandemic and the economic crisis offer a chance to examine our lifestyles, to change destructive habits, and to find more sustainable ways to produce, trade, and transport goods. This is a time for pilgrimages. And he suggests that there's a kind of walking that can just put us deeper inside of our shell, like the labyrinth of Greek mythology. In other words, we can get lost in all of this. The labyrinth, he says, might be our assumption that life will go back to normal. It might reflect our egotism, our individualism, our not seeing, our wanting things to go back to how they were. But there's a way either to get lost in the labyrinth or to emerge from the labyrinth. And he resorts to an image from Greek mythology, Ariadne and Theseus. Theseus is lost in a labyrinth, and Ariadne gives him a ball of thread so that he can find his way out. The ball of thread, he says, we have been given is our creativity to move beyond the logic of the labyrinth, to decenter and transcend. In other words, to go beyond kind of where we've been. Ariadne's gift, he says, is the Spirit calling us out of ourselves. And I love this metaphor he uses. He takes it from G.K. Chesterton, the twitch upon the thread. I actually had to do a little bit of research on the twitch upon the thread. G.K. Chesterton uses that phrase in his Father Brown mystery stories, the twitch upon the thread which can lead us out of the labyrinth. And this is the quote from Chesterton that he is alluding to in using that image. I caught him with an unseen hook and an invisible line, which is long enough to let him wander to the ends of the world and still bring him back with a twitch upon the thread. There is a thread that can lead us out and lead us beyond. And that thread, Pope Francis suggests, is the Spirit, when we're open to the Spirit and what the Spirit is calling us and leading us to at this moment. He says, once we feel that twitch upon the thread, there are many ways to emerge from the labyrinth. What they have in common is the realization that we belong to each other in a mutual relationship, that we are part of a people, and that our destiny is a shared one. And he quotes Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Certainly, the most decisive turning points in world history are substantially co-determined by souls whom no history book ever mentions. And so, among his final words in the book, let yourself be pulled along, shaken up, and challenged. When you feel the twitch, stop and pray, and then act. Say you would like to be part of a different world. Those are his own final words. And then he leaves us at the very end with a poem. It's a beautiful poem. I thought as he leaves the reader in the book with these words, I would like to leave all of you with the words. It's by a Cuban poet who he first encountered in Argentina, Alexis Valdez, and the title of the poem is Hope. When the storm passes and the roads are tamed, and we are survivors of a collective shipwreck, with a sweeping heart and destiny blessed, we will feel happy just for being alive. And we will embrace the first stranger and praise the luck of holding on to a friend. And then we will remember everything we lost. And at once we will learn everything we had not learned. And we will not be envious, since we have all suffered. We'll no longer be idle. We'll be more compassionate. The common good will be worth more than that which we never had. We will be more generous and much more committed. We will understand how fragile it means to be alive. We will exude empathy for who is still with us and who has left. We will miss the old man who was asking for a peso in the market, whose name we never knew and was always beside you. And perhaps the poor old man was your God in disguise. You never asked for the name because you were in a hurry. And everything will be a miracle, and everything will be a legacy, and life will be respected, the life we have won. When the storm passes, I implore you, God, in penitence, to return us to be better as you had dreamed us. So thank you all for your attention. I think we have, what do you think, Catherine? A little time for some questions and conversation?
Yes, first of all, Tom, thank you. That was a really thoughtful and moving presentation that you gave us. So we really appreciate your taking the material and giving it back to us as a gift in the presentation. So yes, we have time for questions. And what I might ask is if people would like, if they would like to ask a question, either raise their hand in their screen there, or raise the hand via Zoom, which you can do on the bottom where there's a place to show reactions.
Yeah, either questions or comments or reaction. Yeah, I think so much in there is just so provocative. I'm curious what some of you might think of some of these ideas.
You gave us so much to think about. I think it really,
Yeah.
we need to kind of like just pause for a moment and
Sure,
absorb
absolutely.
part of it. And maybe one of the things also that you presented at the top, and then we'll get to the gentleman, Paul, with his hand raised, is what did we find throughout the pandemic, which were places where we tried to do something different. I'll just pause on that. And Paul, you have your hand up, please. Oh, and please unmute yourself.
Sorry, we good now?
Yes.
Tom, thanks so much. It was
Sure.
really, I only read the first third of the book so far, so I look forward to going back to the rest. But I was thinking, as in what I read and what you presented so well, there's a common perception that Pope John Paul II, that Wojtyla was really quite a mystic in his own way, and I'm not in any way doubting that. But the imagery, the poetry, the how he integrates everything, I mean, he's so down to earth and so concrete and so grounded. And yet, what are your thoughts about the kind of spirituality that goes into this, and indeed, most likely, the kind of profound mysticism?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. I think it's a spirituality born of his being among the people. Throughout. I think everything was shaped by his experiences in Argentina, and his tremendous sense of the presence of God in the people who are on the peripheries. I think it's very much shaped by those experiences, and it's very much shaped by his um, Ignatian spirituality as a Jesuit, but also his deep appreciation of Franciscan spirituality. I think they both come together. Some of the images that I found and used to accompany the quotes from the book. I mean, there are scores of images like that of his really being present to those on the periphery. The poor, the sick, the marginalized. That's the Franciscan part of his spirituality, and then there's the Ignatian part of finding God in all things. He's very, very grounded, very down to earth, as you said. Yeah, maybe some others might have some thoughts on that too.
I see someone who has Robert. Yes, please unmute yourself and then you can speak. And then Mary Lane, I see you next after.
Just to add to that, I think your question was a really very important one, and your comment, Paul. And my own experience with him is that with the Pope is when I watch him, he is the real deal. He's really so real. He's deeply touched, and you can, even with technology, it gets conveyed, even though I was never in his presence.
How do I get weapons?
It just really, it's so clear that there is a real deep, I think you use the words mysticism about him because it's so compellingly real. There's a little story that I saw on one of these visits that he had, where they set it up in the piazza or some small local place, and of course he goes and visits the local places in Rome, mostly on the periphery, and there was a little boy who had a question, and it was so poignant the way he responded to that little boy who was scared to ask his question. So he called the boy, maybe you've seen this, but he called the boy up, and the boy was scared. He said, come, come. And he had him come and whisper in his ear. And he did. And then the Pope responded to him in his ear. And then he let him go back. And then someone, who I guess who was leading this discussion or effort, asked the little boy if he wanted the Pope to say what happened. And the Pope, the boy said yes, but I can't do it. And so, well, he said, stay with me. And so he did. He said that he was worried that his father wouldn't have a job. But it was so moving. And he is really touched deeply by the Spirit of God, deeply. And you don't even have to understand what language he's saying. It's there, and one sees it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Is it Carol? Was that your Carol? Is that right?
Yes, that's
Great.
right.
Thank you. So Mary Lane had her hand up before, and Mary, you'll need to unmute yourself and please ask your question or make your comment. You're still not unmuted, Mary.
Okay, am I okay now, Catherine?
Very
All
good.
right. I don't know if you heard anything I said, but firstly, thank you, Tom. It was so enlightening. And I was thinking too of Pope Francis now on that incredibly dangerous mission, which he is on for this weekend. And I was thinking he's such a living figure of Christ in that he disregards his own safety. And he was just so strongly drawn to the Christians in Iraq and to all people of religion in Iraq. And I mean, it's just, we can look to him with such awe, and it's incredible. So I look forward to reading this book. That was my comment. And I did want to say, to me, the COVID really spotlighted lots of problems in our society, and particularly in the nursing home. I mean, I think it's incredibly unconscionable the way they have been treated, the conditions in nursing homes. And I'm hoping that now the people are aware that there might be some, reformation, some ways of addressing these inequities. We need to do something about it. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Anna Marie, please unmute yourself.
Hello, Dr. Petriano.
Hi, Ann.
Wonderful to see you. And you have, I feel like I'm living in a dream right now, having just listened to this presentation. You have a gift of lifting up the most profound quotes in a book and really tying them together to our current applications of life. And I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, good. Thank you, Ann.
And how, I haven't read the book, but I certainly will, but how interesting how he expanded COVID to COVID moments of his lifetime.
Yes.
And perhaps through generations, like this isn't the first time our civilization has been in this travesty, this trauma of this pandemic. And have we recovered? Have we regrouped? Have we changed from previous crises? my fear is this will only be a dream.
Hmm.
It's a wonderful bar to set. It's, I mean, he hits every single point, including social media and the current crisis of our inability to have a civil conversation. He's right on the pulse of what needs to be healed in this present moment. And I'm so grateful that he wrote this. And
Yes.
my other comment, Tom, was, is there any way we could present this in the House of Congress?
I know, that's
Senate,
what I thought.
for
I would love to
readers?
buy copies to send to everyone
Yeah.
there.
To people who, set the tone for language and
Mhm.
civil communities, which it's been so uncivil. How wonderful would it be for people to hear this dream at
Yeah.
this time? So
Yeah, no, I agree, Anne.
I pray and hope it's not just a dream,
Yes.
and to see the fruits of some of these very lofty
Yes.
ideals actually come to fruition. We all know them in small places in our lives, I'm sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
But as soon as we get in our car and start driving, we see something else. We do see the anger, we do see indifference, we do see it.
Well, I think the more people that read the book, and each of us here kind of spreading the word, and if
Yes,
parishes would read, the more people that read it, the more people can perhaps be grasped by the dream. I just think that because I share the same concern you do, that what's
let it
going to
out.
happen. This all sounds so wonderful, but there's also kind of a pull in the other direction, just to resume business as usual.
Yes. Tom, have you seen students have any interest in something like this? Reading a book, students, young people. Do you
I'm
think
sorry, I didn't hear the first.
do you see an interest amongst your students, college students?
Yeah.
People,
Mm.
with any
I think so. I do think, I mean, I haven't used it in class at this point, but I do see our students as responding to this. Paul, my colleague from St. Joseph, Paul Guinea, what do you think, Paul? Do you think the students would be receptive to this?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's really eminently readable
Hmm.
and really engaging. So yeah, given, the right context of how to present it, when
Yeah.
you said the thing you wish that Congress could hear it, in the tradition of filibuster, senators are allowed to stand up there, famous reading Dr. Seuss, and maybe somebody like Tim Kaine, I pick him because he's a former Jesuit volunteer. I'd love to see, instead of reading the bill for 11 hours last night
Yeah.
at the request of Senator Johnson, Tim Kaine or somebody could have read this book. It would have
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Well, I suggest we send him a book and we make that suggestion to him. And I think
Really?
that the suggestion by Anna Maria to send it to the House would be good. Maybe we can't do that, but we could send it to all the Long Island legislators, So
No, I love that idea. I really
an
do.
assembly person. So other questions? I think Carol had her hand up and Mary Ann as well.
Go ahead, Carol. After you, Carol, please.
Oh, I can't help it. I mean, I was reminded of when I came into the store today, you told me about the Black church on PBS, and I feel so strongly that no conversation, never, ever anymore among white people can leave out the horrors of racism that we have to address. This is what he's talking about. He didn't specify this country, but it's certainly applicable to us, fraternity. And it is so, unless we deal with racism, we're just talking in the wind. And it's everywhere. It's in everything. It's in the legislation locally. It's in, we have to constantly bring it to the fore, constantly. It's everywhere. And it's really the sickness, and it goes all the way back. And I given what I know about human nature, which is which is a lot at my age and my work, but it's so clear that this is fundamental in humanity, that we have two sides of each of us, and it's the beast we feed and which we nourish. And we have got to remember that that's at the sickest place of white communities, and turning it against others as the evils, and so on and so on. But I just want to make sure we're clear that that's fundamental to us. And thank you, Marianne, for giving me that recommendation. And thank you very much, Tom, for your presentation.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for those reminders. Yes.
And I just want to make sure, because your participant name reads otherwise, that everyone understands our speaker just now is Carol Bandini, just in case you guys want to be in touch later on. Yeah, there's a very interesting PBS series available right now on the Black Church. It's 6 sessions, a history of the Black Church in the United States. And it's based on a book, which we have here at the shop, compiled by Henry Louis Gates, who is featured in the series. But really, thanks, Carol, for informing our discussion on the race issue, which we must keep before us. I just want to add, picking up a bit, if I may, on Anne-Marie's comment also, I see this book not only as like a beautiful dreamscape, but also a guidebook. It's very practical. And I think it'd be a wonderful, as we mentioned earlier, perhaps a Lenten practice, or even if you're not practicing that, there are many ways that this book, can help each of us in our reading make decisions. There's a time to choose, right? In the middle section, choose the way we're going to live differently. Choose a way in which we'll apply our talents and interest to make change. Mary, you mentioned the situation in the nursing homes, and a shout out to nurses everywhere. Pope Francis credits a particular nurse with saving his life when he was sick. She had the experience by having been with so many patients, more so than did the doctor. She made a decision to increase his medication, right? And not what the doctor had prescribed. Why? Because she had so much experience, direct experience with patients with end-of-life situations. So again, we're at the quote unquote margins. Our encounters, how are our encounters informing our actions? But anyway, all to say, the book is very practical. There's sections describing in a very accessible way how to discern, taking your next step. Are you following the way of God, or going astray? So any case, that gives me a lot of hope. And I think it'd be a great book to use with young people or in worship communities, to have discussion and to make, small commitments in our own circles about, how we want to come out of this situation and dare to do something differently, dare to be creative and build something new. So anyway, I went on too long.
Oh, that was perfect, Mary.
That's great. That's great. Hey, where can I buy a copy of that book?
Oh, we just happen to have some here at Canio's.
But I'm just going to underscore what Marianne had to say. And Tom, I can't remember the actual phrase that Pope Francis used for his experience in the early 90s, but through that COVID experience of having to be challenged by the liberation theology priest in his community, He did not turn his back on their criticisms or their critique. And through that evolution and thoughtfulness and prayerfulness, he has become a very radical, in the right way, prophet of how we should deal with the world community, from everything in nature that we're surrounded by. And so he's a great example of how we can take a COVID moment to heart to transform how we come out on the other side.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that was a big turning point for him in his own life, for sure.
Yeah. So this is fantastic. We could probably stay for another hour or so with dinner or a coffee or a glass of wine. But Tom does have to go. We don't want to keep him too long. But is there any last questions or comment that folks would like to share with Tom before we part our company for the evening?
You know, can I ask a question? I was wondering how Tom felt about Pope Francis coming under criticism for making this pilgrimage trip to Iraq. Is there any basis for the fact that it's COVID and, you know, he's gathering very large crowds and he's being criticized by some, whereas I'm seeing it as a moment of inspiration because he's leading us by example to those who are marginalized, to those who are really suffering and in pain, and he hears it and he's doing something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the little bit of reading I've done so far and reporting of what it's been like, I just think, you know, the aftermath of this is going to quiet a lot of that criticism, because it's just been so successful, as far as I can tell, on so many levels. You know, the encouragement he's given to the people there, his meeting with some of the Islamic leaders. You know, he just really felt this was something that had to be done. You know, and
Yes.
I
Even
I
in
applaud it.
face of a lot of danger, you know, not only from the
Yeah.
COVID,
Oh, it's so
but from
dangerous. I mean, it's the
the
most dangerous part
hostile
of the world,
environment that he
probably.
was going into. Yeah. Okay.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So again, Tom, thank you so very much for your time and your talents and bringing the book to us. Again, I've just dropped in the chat some information. One link is where you can get the book if you don't have the ability to walk in the store to get it. But also next Wednesday, we are going to have our annual Women's History Month lunch. And it's going to be via Zoom. So there's a link there that you can follow to register for it. It's going to be on Wednesday at 12:30. And we'll just gather with lunch, talk over what's happened over the last year. In fact, the last time we actually had an in-store event was our women's lunch last March. So just as a marker again of the pandemic and how our lives have changed because of that. So everyone is welcome, you men and women, and all are welcome. So, and again, if you wouldn't mind signing the Save Steinbeck's Homestead petition, that would be great too. So that we thank you all for coming. Marianne, I don't know if you have any last thoughts to send us out for the evening.
No, again, I'm so grateful to Tom Petriano for bringing our this rich presentation, and for all of you to gather this evening. This is community, and this makes it happen. So we're appreciating all of your presence, and let's keep going. Let's keep doing it, and with Pope Francis guiding us. So we hope to meet you again, either in person at the bookstore or on another Zoom event. So check our website for upcoming activities. And
Thank you, Catherine, and Marianne, for making this possible.